everyone. Let's get dangerous.
This is so cool.
I know.
It feels so right.
It's Jake Ciely.
He's opening our minds to new ideas. Kill him!
Who is that guy?
Your mama.
You just made the list.
Oh, wait, you serious? Let me laugh even harder.
It's all in fantasy. Please of the range.
Sure, we talk about it all the time. Really? No. Burn.
What is up, you ducks? It is All in Fantasy, Tales of the Ranks, with a good friend and guest today on the show, and then maybe we'll be checking in a little bit later, but we were live this past weekend, depending on when you're listening to the podcast, live this past weekend in New York, kicking off draft season with the Flex Leagues, and I know he doesn't want to take credit, but this idea and this link, I like see already shaking his head if you're watching on the YouTube later on. But if it doesn't happen without you, Jamey, if you don't recall, I was working at football.com, which is a URL that they just threw away, the best URL ever that they could possibly throw away. And I was doing the Consensus 100 ranks before Consensus was the thing, before NFL Network was even doing their 100. And at the end of it, you said to me, why don't we do a league together? And I said, well, I've been trying to make Tout Wars for football happen for years, and that was kind of the kickoff. I don't get a lot of people in the league without your help, and I know you don't like to take credit, but I call Jamey one of the founders of Flex.
I appreciate that. It's an honor to be included in the conversation to be a founder. You've done such a fantastic job with it. You know, I know the Expo has certainly, taken off, and they do a great job with what they're doing, I believe, this weekend. But to me, Flex is the original gathering of all the fantasy, the great fantasy minds in the business. And I know everybody can't make that. Obviously, everybody can't make the Expo, so it's never going to be perfect. But it's just such a fantastic event. You've done it in various locations, and it was always fun with the baseball game. In DC when we did those couple years. I'll never forget me being late to the draft because I was at now Commanders camp and making picks on the phone with you. But you've done such a great job in organizing that and getting so many people to come to the live events, and just continues to get bigger and bigger. So kudos to you for making it what it has become, and I just appreciate you saying that I've helped you build it.
Well, thank you, and thank you for that. And yeah, the biggest thing was just I know Jamey is defending champion, and I know we always want to brag and get the belts, and it's an industry league, so you beat it. But it's more about I had never met Jamey in person until that day, and I had never met a lot of these people. There's people in Flex this year that I had never met till this past weekend, which is the big part of it, getting together and hanging out. So right off the top, for people that don't know in Flex, of course, I ban kickers, no question about it. But the biggest thing that we always say when we ban kickers is add a second flex to kind of get that depth to your team, to not just throw away position. So right off the top, Jamey, you're a defending champion. This isn't your first title either. Does your strategy change when you have that second flex when you're drafting? Does it make you lean more into running back, more into wide receiver, or it doesn't really matter until you get into the mid-rounds?
I think when it's half PPR, it doesn't necessarily force you to only take receivers. Full PPR, you're probably going to lean that way a lot more. At least you probably should, just based on how the nature of the position is in terms of depth and production. But I think it just allows you to not necessarily focus on I have to fill out my quote unquote starters. They're starters. People look at see the word flex and think, oh, this is going to be my third running back or it's going to be my fourth receiver. No, that's a starter for you. That's somebody that's in your lineup weekly. And so for me, I didn't necessarily plan. I don't love to go into a draft with a strategy past the first couple rounds. And the way that it unfolded for me, which I'm sure we'll talk about, is it was a very receiver heavy build. So I just kind of went with the way the board was unfolding, and I think when you're with a lot of smart fantasy players, I don't want to use the word analyst because obviously a lot of people listening are smart fantasy players and their leagues are smart. And you start to see a significant heavy run on a certain position, you like to feel comfortable if you have that position locked up. For me, I went receivers early, and I like the fact that I have 5 guys that I'm very comfortable and confident in, which in this case, 2 of them will be my flexes. So, it was just a strategy. Like I'm going to go that way as it was sort of unfolding. So yes, I do think that you should put some emphasis on the flex spots, not necessarily, especially if you're going to shy away from, let's say, filling out your second running back spot, for example, if you're a hero RB or zero RB drafter, that flex is just as important.
So, yeah, you kind of tied in the second question, which was going to be, was your plan to go receiver heavy, which obviously you're just open to however thing, which is kind of, we had opposite drafts. You and I did. We normally had been drafting next to each other. It was, I think, the first time in years that hasn't happened. It felt weird looking at you across the table over there. But I ended up with 4 running backs in the first 7 rounds. As you mentioned, you already had your 5th wide receiver at that point, and then you finished things off with mostly running backs. I finished things off with mostly wide receivers. And I want to ask if this was part of your thinking in this, because you kind of touched on it, but to go a little bit deeper, like my thought process was as the draft was unfolding, obviously it's first or last. We just want the title. We don't care if we finish in 4th place.
Yep.
But when I had Mixon as my second, I was like, okay, that's fine because I could get Higgins back in the 4th, which was my plan. Higgins, Pickens, Cooper, somebody in that range, that same tier. But after that, when Kamara fell to me in the 3rd or 5th as my 3rd running back, I was like, man, I just can't ignore it. And now, I'm not saying I was pot committed, to use the poker term, but at that point, I'm like, wow, my 3rd running back is better than most anybody's, probably better than anybody's. And even if Nick Chubb isn't healthy by week 3 or 4, and then he's 100%, Nick Chubb being there made me say, you know what, I'm not going to be able to make up the ground at wide receiver, so let me take the all-in approach and just dominate everybody at running back. Was that kind of your thinking with wide receiver and say, you know what, I already have Kenneth Walker. My second running back isn't going to be much better than anybody else's second running back, so let me just kind of, quote, again, all in with wide receiver, and now I have that advantage. If you look at your team, you arguably have the best wide receiver group.
Yeah, I mean, if they hit, and it worked out well that I know you had to shuffle some of the draft around because of travel issues for people and situations. I think originally I was picking 9th, and that's not necessarily a bad spot in the first round because for me that's AJ Brown, but I think there's a little bit of a break with the first 8 guys, and so to get St. Brown, and then I took Harrison in the second round. And at that point, I was kind of committed to, okay, let me see what's there in the 3rd round. And again, half PPR, you can go either way with running backs, receivers. When Debo was sitting there, and so at that point, I was like, okay, I'm going to go pretty heavy receiver. So I didn't want to miss out on. I feel like there's 17 like pretty comfortable running backs that could all be in the top 10 conversation, top 12 conversation, and it ends with Walker for me. And so it was like a tier break. Okay, I'm going to take Walker, and then it was those next 2 picks. I had some tough calls. And, it's like you start to see the board, and you and I were in different spots. Like you said, I was toward the back end picking 8th. You were toward the front end, picking 4th or 5th. And so, you kind of like to see what's happening behind you. And there wasn't a lot of receivers off the board behind me at that point in the draft. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to see which backs kind of come back. And then it was like, okay, they almost all came back, the guys that I like, in a tier. And I'm like, okay, now let me grab a tight end. At that point, it was, I think, round 7 or round 8. Let me grab a quarterback. And I just kept sort of playing it out. Now, I would have liked another guy in between Walker and Brian Robinson for me to make it a little bit more, better foundation at that position. But I'm okay with the way that it worked out. So, yes, I did lean heavily into receiver, especially, looking at some of the other managers and, you in particular. I love the way you built your team, but obviously you're chasing one position, I'm chasing another, and it feels like as we've seen in fantasy the last couple of years, for me at least, it's easier to chase running backs. That's kind of the approach I had.
Yeah, and I wish if I had the choice between the two, not just because it's your team and you're defending champion, I'd rather have gone that approach. But as you mentioned, the draft fell certain ways. So there's a player that you actually mentioned, Kenneth Walker. I was going to ask you about that because it ties into a question that we're dealing with right now. You know what time it is, Jamey? Camp report. Everybody looks great. This player's doing this. This connection's there. This player's starting. This player's not starting. And our job is to try and parse through all that noise and help the people who follow us and become better managers, better fantasy players. The Kenneth Walker really ties into this question because we're getting the grub. Hey, he loves Walker and actually even likes him in the passing game. But also, the Seahawks are going to pass more, and Geno's going to be back to 2 years ago. And how difficult, one, is it for you to try to parse through this noise? And then two is, do you have an approach? Is it like, hey, if one beat reporter says something, whatever, but if 10 say something, then I'll pay attention? Or is it what you see with your eyes? How do you go through and say this matters and this doesn't?
I mean, I think everybody's going to have a different approach. I always like to tell people it's usually confirmation bias. If you like something and you hear something positive, you're going to lean that way even more. If you're against it, you're going to lean that way even more. If you hear something negative, and if it's, something that's just overwhelming, like the example I give this year is, it sounded like there was just a tidal wave of Javonte Williams sucks. And then all of a sudden everything comes out at the start of camp. Well, Javonte Williams looks great, is awesome. Sean Payton loves him. It's like, okay, which side of it is it? And that's where
Right.
I think, those type of comments is really what you have to sort of, parse through, as you said. I think in the case of Walker, and clearly ties into Zach Charbonnet, who's a talented second option on that team, is you have to understand, like, there's not a lot of bell cows anymore. There's not a lot of true featured. We've been doing this a long time, where you're chasing those 300 carry type of guys. So Walker is going to share. He's going to be part of a tandem. Hopefully, it's not a committee. That's what you want to really avoid at this point is 3 guys. So the thing I like about Seattle and I like about Walker is they're going to run more plays. They're going to be faster. Ryan Grubb's offense is going to modernize that team a little bit, where they've been sort of stuck in the Pete Carroll win by defense and hope the quarterback saves you at the end. It just doesn't work anymore. And so I like the fact that he's going to get more catches. I think even though he may come off the field a little bit more, especially in some hurry up situations, 2-minute offense, obvious passing downs, that was going to be the case anyway. But he should catch the ball more on first and second down. And I think that's something that, I was actually, it might've been the last combine I covered, but he was on set with us and he said, the knock on him was you don't have the same type of hands as Breece Hall. Cause that was the debate, Hall versus Walker from a prospect standpoint. And he's like, I can catch the ball and I've done it in my career and I did it in high school, blah, blah, blah. So I think he'll showcase those type of things as well. And so he should be the goal line guy. They should score more points. They should run more plays. Those things are all, benefits to me. So I like Walker. I'm not going to reach for him, but I also understand, like, I want pieces of that offense, and he's one of those pieces.
So there's somebody else in here who's getting some preseason buzz. And when you took him, I kind of like gave you a little nod across because it really kind of ties into what you say too, is it's hard for somebody like myself and you, like you watch college players. I have guys I really like that I think people don't like as much, and that kind of always kind of pushes you towards them, like, oh, I like him. I don't know why anybody else doesn't. Like, I was a Jalen McMillian fan before the draft. I thought he got overlooked mostly because of the injury, and then, of course, the other prospects coming out in Washington. But you took him. He's getting some camp news. Obviously, we know if Godwin and Evans stay healthy, probably a non-factor in fantasy most weeks, if at all. But there's the thought that I want to ask you is, do you ever consider, because you have Chris Godwin, do you ever consider wide receiver, quote unquote, handcuffing, where you get that third option that might not matter? Last year's was JSN. Didn't even really matter because they stayed healthy all year. This year it could be Romeo Doubs or McMillian like you took. So is that ever in your mind that we're now in a world where wide receiver handcuffing is a thing like running back handcuffing?
So we call it on our show the friendship strategy. And it really was more
I like that better.
Adam Azer did this, asking the same question. And he said, I'm going to do it. And the team that he did it with, I'm sorry, I think it was after the season, but he did it, as an approach. It was the Michael Crabtree, Amari Cooper tandem. And that if you get the 2 players at different price points, clearly it's different. This would probably be more an Evans Godwin conversation, but if you get the 2 players at different price points, almost every week you're going to have a potential top 15 caliber player. And that's the way it worked out with those 2 guys. He was, coming off the year. It definitely wasn't, he may have had those guys that year, but it was coming off that year where, they were both successful. In the case of these 2 guys, I don't think I'm going to end up starting Godwin and McMillian most weeks. Like you said, we'll have to see how it plays itself out. And definitely there's the upside of an injury, but like you said, I think you laid it out perfectly. He's a prospect that got overlooked a little bit. He ended up in a situation where, long-term, he's got a lot of upside. But he's also playing behind a 31-year-old Mike Evans. He's playing behind Godwin, who, said this last week to one of my colleagues, Pete Prisco, he finally feels healthy with a knee injury. Well, what happens if he gets hurt again? So I like the fact that he's most likely going to play a lot because they're kicking Godwin back inside. And so when they're in 3 receiver sets, he's going to be that third receiver. And if coverage slants toward Evans, which you expect, and Godwin's gonna, I think, do his thing, but there'll be some opportunities there, and he's not the answer. But we're all chasing the next Puka, and if Evans does miss any time, this is the type of player that fits that mold. Talented player in an offense that I think will still throw the ball to a decent enough level that you can, buy into it. So last round pick, these are dart throws, and it's funny. And I was actually thinking about this, which tells you how wacky we are for doing this job. The reason I won the league last year, twofold. My first 2 picks were CD Lamb and Tyreek Hill and CD Lamb in that order. That's clearly a huge start. My last pick was Kyron Williams, and so it's like how do I find that diamond in the rough again? And again, it's looking at scenarios and players and guys that you like that you can take in a league like this full of very, very smart people. It always feels good when somebody looks at you when somebody looks across the table like you did and go, I like that pick. It makes you feel good. When you get a player like that.
Yeah, it does. And 2 more questions. I'll get you out of here. Thank you for your time as well, by the way. But that actually ties a little bit into this next question too, is we talked about preseason news, trying to figure out camp news, all that type of stuff, but also like this depth chart situation. And the biggest question a lot of people have for Green Bay is what's happening at wide receiver. You speak about like, is he going to be healthy? Well, is Christian Watson going to be healthy? Is Jaden Reed the top guy because he's their quote-unquote Debo blah? But then you get Dontavian Wicks, who came on late last year, and everybody loves his talent. And, I mean, that's somebody to kind of tie into McMillian that I thought was overlooked in his draft 2 years ago. But it seems, at least through camp, through initial reports, through where we haven't seen the preseason game yet, but everything keeps saying that the top 2, at least in being on the field in 2 wide receiver sets and routes, are going to be Watson and Doubs. And yet Doubs is going as the last wide receiver currently. I mean, things will change, but currently he's the last Packers wide receiver. Are you getting in on Doubs because this is ridiculous and he is a top 2, or do you think it's unsettled and maybe the answer is just draft Jordan Love and avoid the mess?
I think it's all the above.
Okay.
I don't know how you have it ranked. I've always had Doubs ranked ahead of Wicks, but they've kind of been close. Even though I think Wicks, if he gets the opportunity, will do better than what Doubs does. But clearly, like you said, when you look at snap counts from a year ago, Doubs was always on the field. I don't know if it's because I think my colleague Dave Richards has to look into this. Is he the better blocker of the group? Obviously, Watson with his injuries and Reed feels like he's kind of penciled in for the slot role. I just want to get at least one of these guys. I think of the 4. You got to pay a little bit more of a price for Reed and for Watson, and people differ on how you feel about those guys. For me, Watson is the one, if he hits, he's going to be the best by far. But for just the way that this league is built and the way that you've, structured this, when you have the potential to start 5 wide receivers, and if you lean a certain way, you have to have some guys on your bench that are, I couldn't just draft the 5 that I did and hope that I'll mix and match, with the 2 flex options with some running backs. This just wasn't the way I built this team. So I needed some high upside, receivers toward the end of the draft. And it was funny because Andrew Erickson of Fantasy Pros, the joke amongst fantasy people, fantasy analysts, is Dontavian Wicks is the best of the group, because he's the one that we all want to see on the field. And so Andrew was looking at the draft board. He was, I forget who he was talking to. Maybe Jay Feliciano. I think I'm saying his last name right.
Felicio. Close. Close.
Jay Felicio. I apologize.
You made him a little bit too Italian.
I think he was standing near him, and I was sitting next to Jay. And he said, he's like, oh, my God, Dontavian Wicks hasn't come off the board yet. What are you guys doing? And I was like, yeah, he's in this range. I'll see if he comes back to me. And sure enough, he did. I look at Andrew. I go, there you go. And I looked, and I guess Andrew also took him in his draft in a similar spot.
Yeah.
If he hits, could be great. Also could be the odd man out, and we're, watching him and Bo Melton, give high fives on the bench because those are the 4 and the 5, and Matt LaFleur just doesn't like it. But they have just a very interesting and intriguing receiving core that I think any given week we could see one of those 4 guys go off.
I'm with you on that one. And currently Doubs, actually, and Wicks, love both their values. Not a big fan of the tight ends, though, unless Tucker Kraft. One of them has to get hurt, in my opinion, for them to be valued. I don't want to play that game. And I keep bringing up this reference. It's like, you know this, Jamey. The last team to have 2 top 10 tight ends, let alone top 5 tight ends, the New England Patriots, which just happen to have Tom Brady, Aaron Hernandez, Rob Gronkowski, which just isn't replicated anymore. Yep. Like, do people already forgot about O.J. Howard and Cameron Brate? Remember that one? Like, well, we can draft them both. They'll both be actually, well, neither of them will be good.
Yeah.
So speaking of all that and tight ends, as I transition, the Evan Ingram / also wide receiver questions at Jaguars is another one that people have as I get you out of here. Evan Ingram, obviously the target workload was off the charts last year. We know Calvin Ridley's gone. Another kind of guy I had a soft spot for, Brian Thomas. I thought most years would have been a tier 1 quote unquote wide receiver in the draft, but this year's draft was just so top heavy. I kind of put him in a tier by himself. It was 1.5 for me. I'm like, Brian Thomas would be there most years, but I just can't put him with those guys. So again, this is me coming from a soft spot for Brian Thomas, who I think will replicate Calvin Ridley's numbers. I think he's going to step in and immediately do that. How are you making things, or like how do you see things shaking out? Because Gabe Davis is there, and we've seen Gabe Davis do the big games, have the big games, disappear and get zeros for weeks. It really comes down to, is Evan Ingram, in your opinion, going to be the 1 or 2 option again this year, or is he potential overvalue? And then 2, are you on Brian Thomas, or do you think it's a mistake and maybe Gabe Davis, the veteran, is the answer?
No, I think he will with the upside of Brian Thomas. Gabe Davis is going to have his moments. We've certainly seen, everybody was chasing the 4 touchdown game from the playoffs, a few years ago in Buffalo. And Doug Peterson, I had the privilege of going to the NFL owners meetings. I do that every year. And he kept talking about he's earned 90 targets a year for a reason. Well, I mean, if it's a 90 target guy for what we talk about, that's not great. If he's a 120 target guy, then he's going to be probably a pretty significant fantasy guy. And I do think that he's the type of player in the early part of the season that could be one of our waiver wire darlings if he goes undrafted in a lot of leagues, because get off to a good start till Brian Thomas, starts to connect. We know rookies take a little bit of time sometimes. And he's the one I think by the end of the season will be doing well. For me, Christian Kirk is the best Jaguars receiver, even though I don't disagree that Thomas could replicate Ridley's numbers. I don't think it will be in the same capacity where it's spread out over the course of the season. Hopefully he stays in the end zone, Thomas does, as opposed to what Ridley did a year ago. But Kirk is kind of I think if you believe in Christian Kirk, you can't really believe fully in Evan Ingram because they shared the same part of the field. And so will those 2 guys do different things than we saw a year ago? And obviously Ingram's numbers popped when Kirk had I think it was groin injury and missed the remainder of the season. So Ingram to me is the last of the top 8 tight ends. Once you get past the group, I don't need to name the names, but if you're a Jake Ferguson guy, if you're a Brock Bowers guy, I like Ingram better than that group of guys behind him. And I think we're talking about still an 80+ catch tight end. I'd like to see him get more than 5 touchdowns, which has just been a problem for him. Can he still be around 900 yards? I think that's realistic. So where he was on the board for what my team build was, I was okay with drafting him in that spot.
All right, I lied. I want to get one more question out of you before we get out of here. And a reminder for everybody out there, since this is a new podcast, thanks to Apple Podcasts for making us have to do this for the 3rd time. We have the giveaways where you can get FTN memberships and a copy of Madden. So please review, rate. You've already done all this before, but please do it again. Subscribe, rate, review, tweet about it. Send me the screenshots at Ciely at The Athletic, and you get entered into the contest. It's a free contest. So we need the help to get this podcast started again because it's fresh start all over. Thank you, Apple Podcasts, one more time. Jamey, before you get out of here, I hate to do this because hopefully nobody in your future leagues, although I am in one more league with you, I finally took down the IDP league after all these years. It took me forever, but I did it. But I do. Everybody wants to know, what's the one mid to late round target that you're just like, if I get him on my team, because mine's, I'll say it, mine's Khalil Shakir. And I'm worried that Shakir is going to get the last year Jahan Dotson bump where he keeps moving up, and all of a sudden he's not a value anymore. Is there one that's currently in your eye? Like, basically, you want to get him on your team because it feels good because he's your guy. Obviously, you're not going to overdraft him and go crazy if it goes too far.
I guess that guy for me would probably be Rico Dowdle right now. Just looking at the Cowboys backfield and what it could be. I know it's not going to be, the heyday of Ezekiel Elliott, and Zeke is still there. Offensive line's a little bit of a concern, but he's still a good enough price where you could be getting, a top 20-ish caliber running back just based on the volume. I mean, Zeke is, hanging around, and I think, Jerry would like to see, old Zeke, but he's old Zeke. And to be honest, I'm going to say this out of both sides of my mouth. I hope they trade for somebody because it would be fun to see a Khalil Herbert,
Samaje
Perine
or something like that.
He's, I think, the prize. But, if Javonte Williams were to get kicked to the curb by the Broncos, but really it's more realistic, probably Samaje Perine. But, those caliber of players, what we're talking about. But it would be fun to see somebody else in that backfield. And that's kind of why Rico Dowdle is a good option, just because he's going to most likely be the best running back in Dallas. And that's still something you can covet.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I agree with everybody who's following Jamey at Jamey Eisenberg. Tell everybody, over at CBS, Fantasy Football Today, what else? Anything you got coming out this week or fresh that you want people to know
Round
about?
3 is Sleepers, Breakouts, and Busts. They make us do 50 of them, so the third round for me is coming out this week. We're just pumping out content like everybody else, so check us out, CBS Sports, CBSSports.com. CBS Sports HQ. I'll be on there later today with Dave Richard, and this season we're actually doing a little bit more of a TV push on CBS Sports Network. So I think it'll be like 1 o'clock, 3 days a week. If you want to see our ugly faces on TV, you can check us out there.
one of the few multi-time champions of the flex leagues, and yes, helped found it. So I'll give him always that credit. Now
And
we
I've
got to
had
get
some,
you.
like office moving around stuff, so the belts are going up behind me today.
Oh, nice. Oh, yeah, with that heavy chain that might take down your entire shelf behind you. How much that thing, how much it weighs. Appreciate it, Jamey. We'll be back on Tuesday next week with Chris. Will be back in the house, back in Canada. He was finally able to get a flight, so that'll be good for that. And until then, we love you guys and enjoy your drafts.